gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, my good friend from New York, Mr. Meeks, for his leadership in helping support this legislation, bringing it to the House floor. And I want to thank the gentleman from Massachusetts for his leadership in recognizing this serious human rights travesty that's happening. I also want to thank the 11 House Foreign Affairs Committee Republicans who are co-sponsors of this legislation, including Mr. Smith of New Jersey. And I want to thank Senator Rubio from Florida for working with the gentleman from Massachusetts on finding a bipartisan and bicameral compromise to bring this important legislation to the floor. And Mr. Speaker, it is past time for this chamber and the Congress to act to stop the Chinese Communist Party from using American consumers to subsidize its brutality. Preventing products made with slave labor from contaminating our market is a long-standing priority of U.S. trade, not just because it puts American manufacturers at a disadvantage, but because the American values that we all share will not tolerate it. Truly free trade cannot involve slave labor. But today, the CCP is using the forced labor of Uyghurs and other minorities to help bankroll its genocide against those very same groups. The repression taking place right now in Xinjiang is breathtaking in its scope and in its brutality. More than 1 million people have been locked in concentration camps, subjected to surveillance and brainwashing on a massive scale. Families are being broken up and children are being taken from their parents. Forced sterilization and forced abortion are being used to limit births among ethnic groups targeted by the CCP. This is outrageous human rights violations, and the world cannot turn a blind eye. It is a horrific warning, not only to China's neighbors and to the American people, but to the world. The Chinese Communist Party is fundamentally focused on expanding its power and its authoritarian style of government. It views things that it does not control, like religion, cultural identity, and the yearning of all people for freedom, as threats that must be destroyed. And because we've drawn the CCP into many of our most critical supply chains, it has the ability to hold our national security hostage while it uses U.S. consumers to subsidize its atrocities. This cannot stand. As many as 1 in 5 cotton garments globally are potentially tainted with Uyghur slave labor. Last year, Border Protection seized a 13-ton shipment of human hair that originated in Xinjiang's forced labor system. We have a duty to prevent the CCP from making Americans complicit in these sickening abuses. For that reason, I support the bipartisan bill before us today, and with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in recent years, the world has stood by as the Chinese Communist Party has detained more than 1 million ethnic minorities in concentration camps where they are tortured, brainwashed, and put into forced labor. This is all part of a deliberate program by the CCP to wipe out their ethnic identity, their religion, their culture, anything that might compete with the Communist Party for their loyalties and affection. We have a moral duty to speak out against these horrifying crimes. But we have an even greater duty to avoid funding this genocide by paying for slave labor in Xinjiang. Many American companies have built their businesses on values that include respect for basic human rights. The United States must continue to lead the world in setting corporate responsibility standards. There can no longer be business as usual with China. The world is watching. While this bill did not go through regular order in the Foreign Affairs Committee, I commend Chairman McGovern and Senator Marco Rubio for coming to this important bipartisan agreement. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your leadership, and it's good to have a bipartisan bill where we stand united in one voice for human rights and to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable. I support this bill. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and yield back the balance of my time.